When I bought my cozy cottage in Meadowbrook Pines, I never expected that a 3-foot concrete garden gnome would ignite a war. But then again, I also didn't expect to live across the street from Karen Devereux-President of the Meadowbrook Pines HOA, self-proclaimed neighborhood guardian, and quite possibly the pettiest person I've ever encountered. I had moved into the neighborhood after years of renting in cramped apartments, finally ready to enjoy homeownership with a modest backyard, a peaceful porch, and the freedom to decorate how I liked. That illusion didn't last long. The trouble began the very first weekend I moved in. I'd barely unloaded my last box when Karen marched up my driveway in her khaki caprice and clipboard in hand. She gave me a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes and said, "Welcome to the neighborhood, Mr. Carter. I hope you've reviewed the HOA guidelines. We take community standards very seriously around here." I remember blinking, confused, still holding a box of dishes. Yeah, I skimmed it," I said. She frowned, as if that answer wasn't good enough. "Well, please make sure to follow them closely. We pride ourselves on maintaining order." I thought she was just being thorough, maybe even helpful. Turns out that was Karen's friendly version. Over the next few weeks, I received notices about excessively creative mailbox paint, improperly positioned recycling bins, and unapproved yard decorations. It was ridiculous. Still, I tried to comply without making waves, but I drew the line when Karen came after Norman. Norman, in case you're wondering, is the name of my garden gnome. I picked him up at a flea market in Vermont years ago, ceramic, weathered, a little wonky, with one eye painted slightly crooked and a crooked little pipe in his mouth. To me, he was more than just a decoration. He was a good luck charm. Norman had been with me through 4 moves and a lot of late-night ramen dinners. When I planted him in the flower bed near my porch, it felt like I had finally arrived. I was home. But, apparently, Karen had other opinions. 3 days after I set Norman down in the mulch bed, I got an official HOA violation notice. Unauthorized lawn ornament. Please remove immediately or face a $150 fine. I read the letter 3 times, sure it had to be a joke. Who finds someone over a gnome? I walked outside, Norman still proudly guarding the begonias, and saw Karen staring at me from across the street like she was daring me to defy her. Rather than back down, I wrote a polite email to the HOA board explaining that Norman was in my flower bed, not the lawn, and that he posed no hazard, wasn't offensive, and, frankly, brought joy to my mornings. I even included a photo of Norman with a coffee mug captioned, "Just a happy little guy enjoying retirement." No reply, but the fines kept coming. After 3 notices and another knock on my door from Karen herself, I finally responded with a simple, firm statement. I won't be removing Norman. If the HOA wants to take this to court, I'll see you there. That was when things got weird. One morning, I walked out with my coffee and felt that something was off. My begonias were disturbed, and Norman gone. Just the circular impression of where he'd stood and a few tiny footprints in the mulch. My stomach dropped. At first, I thought it was a prank. Maybe kids, maybe a neighbor with a twisted sense of humor. But then, I noticed the note taped to my front door. No envelope. Just bold block letters scrawled in black marker. Conform or move. I stared at it, my knuckles turning white around the coffee mug. That wasn't just pettiness. That was a threat. Now, I'm not the type to jump to conclusions, but Karen had made it clear that Norman was a personal affront to her vision of a clean and orderly neighborhood. And given her previous stunts with the mailbox paint and the recycling bins, I had a gut feeling she was behind this. But I had no proof. And if I confronted her without evidence, she'd just turn it around and accuse me of harassment. I needed to be smarter. I needed a plan. So I hatched one. That afternoon, I visited the local hardware store and picked up a motion-activated security camera 1 of those sleek little devices that looks like a light fixture but records 24/7 with night vision and mobile alerts. I installed it on the porch, angled right at the flower bed where Norman had once stood. I also went back to the flea market website and ordered another garden gnome nearly identical to Norman, but with a little fishing rod instead of a pipe. I named him Norman Jr. and placed him in the exact same spot as his predecessor. Then I waited. For 3 nights, nothing happened. I started to think maybe I'd gone too far. Maybe it had been a one-time prank after all. But on the 4th night, I got the alert on my phone. Motion detected. Front yard camera. My heart jumped. I grabbed my phone and opened the app. The footage was grainy at first, but then it sharpened, and there she was. Karen Devereux, in a hoodie and gloves, creeping across my lawn with the stealth of a raccoon. She crouched low near the begonias, grabbed Norman Jr. by the fishing rod, and scurried back toward the shadows like she was on some sort of black ops mission. I couldn't believe it. She had actually come onto my property in the middle of the night to steal a garden gnome, and I had it all on video. The next morning, I printed out a still frame from the footage, Karen mid-squat, gnome in hand, and slid it into a manila envelope. I walked across the street and placed it gently on her front porch, right next to her potted hydrangeas. I didn't ring the bell. I didn't leave a note. Just the image of her, red-handed. 2 hours later, I got an email from the HOA board. The subject line? Formal complaint withdrawn. I smiled. But the war wasn't over. Not yet. Karen's silence after receiving that envelope was louder than any tantrum she could have thrown. For 2 days, she didn't so much as glance in my direction. No snide comments, no clipboard patrols, nothing. It was almost eerie, like the calm before a hurricane. But I knew better than to think she was done. Karen didn't retreat. She regrouped. And on day 3, the retaliation began. It started with a sudden flurry of HOA violations. I received 3 in one day: one for non-regulation mulch color, another for visible trash bins during non-collection hours, and a third for excessive lawn ornamentation. That last one made me laugh out loud. I had exactly 1 lawn ornament, Norman Jr., and the HOA rules, which I had memorized by now, didn't mention a single word about limits on garden decorations. Karen was clearly grasping at straws, but she wasn't doing it through her own name anymore. These violations were sent from the HOA board's generic email address. No signature, no explanation. Just digital citations and threats of mounting fines. I wasn't going to be bullied. I appealed all 3 violations, quoting the rulebook back at them, section and page number included. And I attached the footage of Karen stealing the original Norman just in case they needed a refresher on what kind of leadership their president had been offering. A week later, 2 of the 3 violations were rescinded. The mulch color one? They claimed further discussion was needed, which was their way of saving face. I didn't care. I had bigger plans. See, while Karen was busy playing HOA sniper from the shadows, I was upgrading my defenses. I added 2 more cameras, one covering the side yard and another with a perfect angle on her driveway. Then I went and bought a full replacement for Norman Sr., a brand new gnome, custom painted, holding a tiny sign that read, "Smile Karen, you're on camera." I placed him dead center in the flower bed, not even trying to be subtle. If she wanted to escalate, so could I. The reaction was immediate. That evening, I caught her standing at the edge of her driveway, arms folded, jaw clenched, staring at the new gnome like it had insulted her personally. I waved. She didn't wave back. Instead, she stormed into her house, and 10 minutes later, I saw her porch lights shut off like she was battening down the hatches. I knew she wasn't done, but I didn't realize just how far she was willing to go until the next morning. I woke up to a knock on the door. Not the usual clipboard Karen tap. This was louder, firmer. I opened it to find 2 men in reflective vests standing there. Behind them, a large truck idled in the street, with a cherry picker and a trailer full of landscaping tools. One of the men squinted at a clipboard and said, "You, Mr. Carter?" I nodded. "We're here to carry out a landscape compliance order," he said. Your property's been flagged for excessive vegetation and unauthorized structures. I blinked. What? He flipped the clipboard around and pointed to a page stapled to the front. It was a notice of mandatory landscaping correction apparently signed by the HOA board. I scanned the page. They were claiming my garden bed violated visibility regulations and that my front hedges were encroaching on community easements. It was nonsense, and worse, they were threatening to fine me for the cost of the landscapers if I didn't comply. I didn't authorize any of this, I said. The guy shrugged. We don't get involved in disputes, we just follow the paperwork. I held up a finger. Wait here. I went inside, pulled up the HOA bylaws on my laptop, and printed the exact section that stated no landscaping alterations could be made without homeowner consent unless it posed a direct safety hazard. Then I returned to the porch and handed the printout to the landscaper. He looked it over, frowned, then nodded. All right, that's enough for me. We're not getting in the middle of a legal mess. He waved at his partner and told him to pack up. As the truck drove off, I saw Karen watching from her window, phone still in hand. I was officially done playing defense. It was time to hit back, and I knew exactly how to do it. You see, in addition to being a petty tyrant, Karen had also gotten comfortable. Too comfortable. For someone who enforced rules like a military general, she had a habit of ignoring them when they didn't suit her. Her backyard, full of violations. Unauthorized fencing, a storage shed sitting on the property line without the proper permit, decorative lighting that stayed on past HOA curfew hours, and don't even get me started on the 6 lawn flamingos she had staked around her pool. I knew all of this because, well, I had cameras. So I compiled a neat little packet of photos, documentation, and time-stamped footage. Then I filed a formal HOA violation complaint. But not through the board. No, I submitted it directly to the Regional HOA Oversight Committee, the one above our local board. It bypassed Karen entirely. 2 weeks later, she was summoned to a mandatory compliance hearing. And just like that, the hammer came down on her. The next time I saw Karen, she wasn't walking with her usual smug swagger. She was in a bathrobe, holding a measuring tape, pacing around her yard while a compliance officer barked orders and snapped photos. The flamingos disappeared. The lights were shut off, the fence got taken down, and the shed? Demolished. She looked like someone who had just lost a war and was being forced to surrender her flag. But even then, she didn't stop. 2 nights later, I caught her on camera again, sneaking toward my flower bed, clearly looking for another gnome to steal. Only this time, I had one last surprise waiting for her. The motion sensor light she triggered was wired to a hidden speaker that blasted the Looney Tunes theme song as soon as it detected movement. Karen screamed, tripped over her own feet, and fell backward into my begonias. The footage. Oh, I uploaded it. And the title. HOA, Karen tries to steal another gnome, gets Looney Tuned instead. It went viral in the neighborhood overnight. The video of Karen's late-night tumble into my begonias didn't just go viral, it went neighborhood legendary. Mark, my neighbor across the street, texted me with about 20 laughing emojis and the message, "Bro, you turned her into a meme." Within a few days, nearly every porch in our cul-de-sac had a garden gnome. Some had signs, others had little security lights mounted next to them. One even had a tiny foam camera hot glued to its hands. It wasn't just about me anymore. Karen had been annoying and bullying people for years, but now, the whole street was in on the joke and they were loving it. At the next HOA meeting, the atmosphere was electric. Normally, these meetings were dry and lifeless, with a dozen residents pretending to care while Karen droned on about mulch tones and mailbox styles, but this time the room was packed. People who hadn't attended a meeting in years showed up, all waiting for the inevitable explosion. Karen walked in 10 minutes late, sunglasses on inside the building, and lips pursed so tightly they looked vacuum-sealed. She didn't even acknowledge the chuckles that rippled through the crowd as she took her seat. The meeting began with the usual agenda points, but no one cared about sprinkler timing or fence repainting guidelines. We were all waiting for the elephant, or should I say, the garden gnome in the room. Eventually, HOA President Mr. Connors cleared his throat and turned to Karen. "We do need to address the recent incident," he said carefully. "The one involving a resident's property and a rather popular video." Karen bristled. "That video was taken without my consent. It was an invasion of privacy and a clear attempt to humiliate me." A woman from the back row chimed in. "Karen, you were on his property." Another added, "You've been stealing decorations and harassing people for years. We're just finally laughing about it." Karen shot to her feet. "That's a lie. I've never stolen anything in my life." I raised a hand. "Would you like me to pull up the video of you taking the original gnome and stuffing it into your tote bag?" She turned beet red and sat down with a thud. Connors cleared his throat again. "In light of recent events, the board has decided to open a formal review of your conduct as a committee member. We'll be reviewing video evidence, community complaints, and violation history." Karen's eyes widened. "You can't do that. I am the HOA." But this time, no one jumped to her defense. Not even Bob, her usual lapdog who once fined a family for having holiday lights up for one day past the deadline. Karen was alone. After the meeting, I expected her to go quiet lick her wounds, plot in silence. But nope. Karen had one more play, and it was the most pathetic one yet. The very next morning, a police cruiser pulled into my driveway. I was sipping coffee on the porch when the officer stepped out and approached. "Morning," he said, hand on his belt. "We received a report of ongoing harassment between neighbors, wanted to ask a few questions." I sighed. "Let me guess. Karen?" He nodded, clearly not surprised. "She claims you've been targeting her with sound traps, lighting systems, and online videos intended to cause emotional distress." I stood up and walked him over to my garden. "Officer, all I've done is replace stolen property, set up motion-activated lighting to deter theft, and upload security footage of someone trespassing. If she feels emotionally distressed, maybe she should stop breaking into my yard." The officer took a quick look around and shrugged. "Looks fine to me. Doesn't look like a criminal matter." He paused. "Off the record, that video was hilarious." I chuckled. "Thanks." He gave me a nod and left, and I watched as he drove straight to Karen's house. She came out, arms flailing, voice raised, but I couldn't hear the conversation. I could only watch her body language go from furious to frustrated to defeated. The officer left after 5 minutes, and Karen went back inside, slamming her door so hard it rattled her shutters. A few days passed in relative peace. It was strange. The air felt lighter. The neighbors were friendlier. Even the neighborhood dogs barked less. Without Karen's constant HOA patrols and petty complaints, it was like the entire street had taken a deep breath. One neighbor, Carla, told me she'd finally put out her wind chimes again. "Karen used to knock on my door at 6 a.m., saying they were too loud," she whispered. "Now? Let her try." And then, the cherry on top, an anonymous package arrived at my door. Inside, a tiny ceramic gnome holding a You-Win flag. No note, no return address, just a silent, perfect gift. I placed it next to Norman Jr. and gave it a name. Victor. Of course, this story wasn't over. Not yet. Karen still had one more meltdown left in her, and it would be the one that sealed her fate for good. Karen's silence didn't last long. Just when the neighborhood thought she might finally take the hint and retreat into whatever drama pit she crawled out of, she resurfaced with the subtlety of a marching band. It started with flyers, dozens of them, printed in bright red ink and stuck to every mailbox, lamppost, and trash bin on the block. The title read, "Don't Be Fooled, The Truth About Our Neighborhood Menace." And below it, a photo of me, mid-blink, cropped from what looked like my old Facebook profile. She called me a digital vigilante, accused me of setting traps, staging videos, and threatening the fabric of our community. It would have been hilarious if it weren't so incredibly pathetic. Neighbors texted me immediately. Mark snapped a photo of the flyer and captioned it, "Dude, she's losing it." Carla replied with a video of herself dramatically throwing the flyer into her fireplace. Most people just laughed, but a few were genuinely annoyed. "She's wasting HOA funds again," one neighbor said. "We didn't approve this nonsense." I wasn't worried about the flyers hurting my reputation. If anything, they made Karen look worse. Still, I figured it was time to return fire, not with drama, but with good old-fashioned neighborly charm. That weekend, I hosted a Gnome and Grill barbecue in my backyard. I sent out open invites to the entire block. Free burgers, lemonade, lawn games, and of course a new gnome decorating contest. Dozens of neighbors showed up, including some I'd barely spoken to before. We laughed, swapped HOA horror stories, and painted little ceramic gnomes in outrageous costumes. Pirate gnomes, disco gnomes, even a Karen gnome, complete with a tiny cell phone and frowning face. Kids ran around playing tag while the adults shared drinks and relief at how the neighborhood had changed since Karen was dethroned. As the sun set, I stood up with a toast. "To freedom from garden tyranny," I declared. Everyone cheered. Someone yelled, "Long live the gnomes!" And I couldn't stop smiling. For the first time since moving into Oak Ridge Estates, I actually felt like I belonged. And that, more than anything, seemed to drive Karen insane. 2 days later, my mailbox was smashed. I found it splintered at the base, bent in half like a crushed soda can. No note, no witnesses. But we all knew who it was. Mark checked his home security camera, and sure enough, Karen's beat-up silver SUV could be seen rolling past my house at 2 a.m., slowing just enough before speeding away. I filed a report, of course, and the cops added it to the growing list of petty infractions Karen was racking up. But I didn't replace the mailbox right away. Instead, I set up a fake one made entirely out of cardboard and duct tape, and then I mounted another camera inside it. Let her try again. Not because she came to her senses, but because someone else finally stepped in. The HOA, fed up with her antics, called a special meeting. This time, it wasn't just the board. A legal representative from the HOA's parent organization, the company that oversaw neighborhood HOAs across the region, showed up. Rumor had it, Karen's behavior had triggered enough formal complaints to merit outside review. When the meeting began, Karen walked in smugly, head high, thinking she could talk her way out of anything. She even brought a stack of her ridiculous flyers, like evidence of a grand conspiracy. But when the lawyer stood and began reading the list of official grievances, that smirk disappeared. Unauthorized use of HOA funds, defamation of residents, trespassing, falsification of violation reports, retaliatory behavior. One by one, the charges stacked up. Karen tried to interrupt, tried to deny, but the lawyer raised a hand calmly. "Ms. Reynolds, I'd advise you not to speak until the end. You are currently under investigation, and anything you say may become part of a formal complaint." That shut her up. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't grandstand. I didn't even show the viral video. I simply said, "All I ever wanted was to be left alone to tend to my garden and enjoy my home." Karen made that impossible, and I believe she's made life hard for everyone here, not just me. Murmurs of agreement echoed around the room. Even the board, previously silent, nodded. The legal rep handed down the verdict. Karen was banned from serving on any HOA board under their jurisdiction for the rest of her life. Furthermore, she would be subject to fines for misused funds and required to issue a formal, written apology to the residents of Oak Ridge Estates. Karen didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stood there, seething with silent rage, clutching her papers like they might dissolve if she squeezed hard enough. That night, her "for sale" sign went up. Nobody said anything, no one jeered or gloated, but we all felt the shift. The quiet, satisfied peace of a community no longer under siege. And me? I had one last surprise waiting. With Karen finally facing consequences and her "for sale" sign glinting in the sun like a white flag, the neighborhood collectively exhaled. You could feel the difference. There was a new lightness in the air, the kind that comes when fear gives way to freedom. People began putting lawn chairs out front again. Kids rode their scooters without looking over their shoulders, and for the first time in years, neighbors waved at each other with genuine smiles instead of polite survival mode nods. Even the community Facebook page, which had once been a battlefield of passive-aggressive posts, was now filled with pictures of dogs, garage sale ads, and gnome memes. Of course, I wasn't done just yet. Karen had taken so much from this community: peace, trust, even the simple joy of gardening. But she'd also inspired something better: unity. I wanted to cement that. So I proposed something at the next HOA meeting, now pleasantly run by Mr. Alvarez, who wore Hawaiian shirts unironically and brought muffins for everyone. A neighborhood gnome contest. Each house could design a gnome, place it in their yard, and we'd have a vote at the end of the month. The prize? Just a $50 gift card and bragging rights, but the real reward was community spirit. The idea caught on like wildfire. Within days, front lawns bloomed with gnome displays. We had pirate gnomes on tiny ships, disco gnomes under glitter balls, and even a yoga gnome in full lotus position. The Joneses on Willow Lane crafted an entire gnome village using dollhouses and fairy lights. Kids went door to door handing out flyers for their favorite gnome, campaigning like it was an elementary school election. It was the most fun the neighborhood had had in years. As for me, I created a tribute gnome. It looked suspiciously like Karen blonde hair, tiny glasses, crossed arms, and a mini clipboard with "Violation" scrawled across the top. I placed it right beside my original gnome, the one she'd stolen, both standing on a patch of turf I labeled Victory Garden. I even installed a little motion-activated speaker that played a faint recording of Karen screeching, "This is entrapment," whenever someone walked by. Tasteful? Maybe not. Hilarious? Absolutely. I didn't expect what happened next. 2 weeks into the gnome contest, a package arrived at my doorstep with no return address. It was wrapped in brown paper, taped meticulously. I opened it cautiously, half expecting glitter bombs or legal threats. But inside was something far stranger: my old gnome. The original, the one Karen had stolen. Except now, he looked different. His paint had been redone. His face, once cheerful and wide-eyed, now had a frown and a tear painted on one cheek. His hands had been glued together in what I could only describe as a begging for forgiveness pose. Taped to the bottom was a note written in shaky cursive: "You win. I'm done. But don't think this neighborhood is better off without someone keeping order." It wasn't signed, but we all knew who it was from. Karen's final act, a passive-aggressive olive branch disguised as a creepy gnome effigy. I didn't keep it. I took a picture, shared it in the neighborhood group with the caption, "Karen's Last Stand," and then buried it in the backyard like the cursed object it was. The reactions were priceless. Cry-laugh emojis. "Rest in peace, little guy." Someone even suggested we create a gnome graveyard next Halloween and reenact the great HOA uprising with animatronics. Despite Karen's attempts to cling to relevance, her house didn't sell quickly. Turns out, being famous in the worst way possible makes for a tough listing. Between her internet infamy, legal troubles, and the lingering scent of scorched social bridges, buyers were wary. Mark told me he saw a young couple tour the house, only to recognize it from the viral ghost chili video. They turned right around. Eventually, a property investor bought it at a discount, planning to renovate and flip it. Karen, meanwhile, vanished. No farewell note, no moving truck fanfare. Just one morning, she was gone, and none of us missed her. But there was still one more surprise in store. The neighborhood gnome contest wrapped up with a block party. We had food trucks, music, and a giant banner that read, "Welcome to Gnomeville." Votes were tallied using cute little ballot boxes placed next to each yard. Kids ran around with gnome-themed face paint, and neighbors brought folding chairs and coolers like it was the 4th of July. When it came time to announce the winner, Mr. Alvarez stepped up with a megaphone and a grin. And the winner of the first annual Oak Ridge Estates Gnome Off is He paused for dramatic effect. Mr. Carter, for his hilarious and heroic Karen tribute gnome. Applause erupted. Mark handed me the gift card with a wink. I took the mic and laughed. Thanks, everyone. I'd like to dedicate this win to our former HOA president. Without her, none of this would have been possible. The crowd roared. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops, casting golden light over the gnome-filled lawns and smiling neighbors, I realized something. I didn't just get justice. I didn't just win. I helped change this place for the better, and I'd do it all again in a heartbeat. The months that followed were some of the best the neighborhood had ever seen. Without Karen micromanaging every blade of grass and every mailbox color, Oak Ridge Estates finally began to feel like a real community. People painted their homes without fear of fines. Porch swings popped up. One neighbor even installed a koi pond, something Karen would have called a mosquito breeding ground, and shut down immediately. But now, it was the centerpiece of the block. Mr. Alvarez, the new HOA president, made good on his promise to scale things back. The HOA rules were rewritten with actual community input, reducing unnecessary restrictions and focusing on real issues like safety and maintenance. Fines were replaced with friendly reminders. Meetings became potlucks. You could feel the stress melt out of the neighborhood like ice on a summer sidewalk. And at the heart of it all, people actually started helping each other again. As for me, I kept on gardening. I built a new section in the front yard just for fun, a miniature gnome village, complete with a windmill, a painted trail, and even a tiny post office. Kids walking by on their way to school would stop and play with the gnome figurines. Parents would snap pictures. It wasn't much, but it brought joy. And after everything Karen had tried to take from me, that felt like a quiet rebellion. The HOA even gave me a plaque, an actual engraved plaque, mounted on a small post near the gnome village. It read, "In recognition of fostering community, creativity, and neighborly spirit, dedicated to Carter, whose gnome stood tall." I laughed when I read it. A gnome stood tall? Yeah, that sounded about right. But as the piece settled in, one last piece of the puzzle fell into place. It came in the form of an anonymous letter. It arrived in a plain white envelope, no return address, no stamp, just left on my doorstep one morning. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in uneven, almost shaky cursive. You think you won, but all you did was destroy something that kept order. Oak Ridge will fall apart without someone enforcing standards. Don't come crying when the neighborhood turns into a junkyard. Enjoy your little gnome kingdom while it lasts. No signature, of course. I read it twice. I didn't get angry. I didn't feel threatened. In fact, I chuckled. It was so... Karen. Even after moving out, after being humiliated, fined, and made into an internet joke, she still thought she was the hero of this story. She still thought that without her, chaos would reign. But she was wrong, because order hadn't collapsed. We didn't fall apart. We flourished. Her absence didn't lead to mayhem. It gave people the space to breathe, to express themselves, to live. I folded the letter and tucked it into my garden shed, right next to the original footage of her pepper-stealing escapade, just in case I ever needed a reminder of how far we'd come. And as for Oak Ridge, it continued to thrive. That winter, the neighborhood organized its first-ever Gnome and Light Festival. People decorated their homes with holiday lights and incorporated gnomes into the displays. Some had gnomes riding sleighs, others building snowmen. One guy even dressed up as a gnome and handed out hot chocolate. The local news caught wind of it and did a full segment. From HOA horror to holiday cheer, how one neighborhood gnomed their way to happiness. It was cheesy, sure, but it was true. I stood out on my porch one evening during the festival, sipping mulled cider and watching the lights twinkle across the neighborhood. Mark came over with his kids, who immediately ran to my gnome village to rearrange the tiny mailboxes again. He handed me a beer, clinked bottles, and said, "You know, if someone made a movie out of this, nobody would believe it." I smirked. Karen would demand script approval. We both laughed. Eventually, Karen faded from memory. Her house was bought, renovated, and turned into a cozy rental for a young couple with a baby on the way. They planted a small flower bed out front and hung fairy lights across the porch. No screaming, no threats, no clipboard fines. Just life moving on. But every so often, someone new to the neighborhood would ask, "Hey, what's with all the gnomes?" And someone would smile and say, "Let me tell you about Karen." It became local folklore, a cautionary tale, a bedtime story for new homeowners. Beware the HOA tyrant who thought she could rule with fines and fear only to be undone by a garden gnome and a well-placed motion sensor. So, here's what I learned. Sometimes, the smallest things like a stolen pepper or a missing lawn ornament can be the spark that lights a wildfire of change. Sometimes, standing your ground, even when it seems petty, is exactly what's needed to push back against people who misuse power. And sometimes, revenge doesn't have to be bitter or cruel. Sometimes it just looks like a community full of smiling neighbors, twinkling lights, and 1,000 little gnome hats bobbing in the breeze. Karen thought she could control everything. In the end, all she controlled was her own downfall. And me? I got my gnome back and so much more,